Hello, everybody. Welcome to this course in eschatology. And I want to thank you for enrolling in the class. I hope that you find it exciting and beneficial. And if at any time you have questions or maybe you disagree with something, let me know. We can discuss it. This is all about learning. So anyway, this is not a real professional video. I've had the experience in the past where I've asked students to write an exegetical paper and they had no idea what I was talking about. And so I thought it would be a good idea to go ahead and explain that right up front. Try to give you as accurate a picture as possible of what I have in mind when I ask for you to write an exegetical paper. And so I put together this little diagram to try and explain it. We'll be talking about two parts, the preparation part and then the writing part. But first, the preparation part, which has to do with the gathering together the content for the paper. And so let's just look at that. Shrink that down a little bit. You'll see here that there are three parts, what I call observation, the first part, interpretation, and application. So these will be your three main headings in your paper. So I'm not looking for a lot of creativity right there. I'd like to see those headings in your paper. That tells me which part I'm reading. And it also helps me to know if you really understood what that part was all about. So let's talk about observation. We observe both the text itself and the context. So you have the text up here and the context down here. As we look at the text, what you want to look for are parallelism, expressions in the text that are saying the same thing in a parallel way. This is really common in Hebrew literature, and so that's why I put it in here, because it pops up all the time in the Bible. And the second category is sensory expressions. But then there's contrasts, things that, this happens a lot also where the author is contrasting one idea or attitude with another one. You also want to look for words in the text that are expressing dialogue. Who is speaking? And at what point did somebody else take over speaking? Is the narrator speaking, or is Jesus speaking, for example, in a gospel passage? And also words that indicate progression. Words like, and then after that, or and then the following day. Those are expressions that give the idea that the narrative is progressing towards the end of the passage. And also repetition of certain words and key phrases is really indicative of what the author's theme is. And so this is really important. So really the whole purpose of this section here, or this part of your research, is to look at the passage. Too often we don't actually look at a passage of Scripture. We jump right into trying to figure out its meaning. And what we often do is we just reach back to things we've heard, things we've already been told before, and automatically plug that into the passage without actually seeing or hearing what the text says. I wanted to come back to this idea of sensory expression, just to explain what I mean. What you're looking for there are words that indicate anything to do with what we sense in this world. Things that you hear, things that people feel, things that people see. You're not going to find too much about smelling in the Bible that I know. I can't think of a passage right now that deals with smelling, but I threw that in there too because it is one of the five senses. And tasting. So these are words and expressions in the text that are all about the sensing part of our being. So that's the part dealing with the text, looking at the text itself. So then what we also do is we want to look at the context. And of course most people understand that context means looking what comes before and what comes after. But it is also much more than that. So there is an inner context and there is an outer context. The inner context is made up of two parts. The structure of the text, that's part of the inner context. In other words, what is the overall argument in the book, for example, the larger text? So if you take just one verse out of context, you can understand it one way. But if you tie it into the apostles or the prophet's overall direction of where he's going and what he's trying to do, then that gives it a whole different flavor. So that's what I mean by understanding the structure of the text. And also looking at parallel passages. A parallel passage is where either the author of the text that you're studying has borrowed text from another text, or there is somebody else who borrowed their text. So it's the relationship between different texts in the Bible. Sometimes it involves direct quotation. Sometimes it involves what we call recontextualization. It's a fancy word for saying that somebody borrowed that text and used it in a completely different way, which happens quite often in the New Testament. And then there's also elaboration. Elaboration is where they took an idea and they expanded on that idea. They talked about the implications of that idea. So you're looking for relationships between the text that you're studying and other texts in the Bible, basically is what we're doing here. This is really important when it comes to eschatology, because in eschatology, a lot of the language of the New Testament is completely dependent on the Old Testament roots of that language. And so it's really important to go back to those roots and understand that context. That really sheds light on the meaning of the New Testament authors. So that's inner context, and then there's the outer context. In the outer context, first of all, you have the external texts of various kinds. Jewish texts, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls. You have Christian texts, what we call the Church Fathers. You have Greek texts of the time that can shed light on your biblical text. And so basically what you're doing here is you're asking, is there anything written that's outside of the Bible that can shed light on the meaning of this passage? And then there's the external world, a complicated world that has multiple dimensions. And I have a little diagram here. Let me see if it pops up. So you have the political world, the social world, the historical world, the geographical world, cultural world, literary world, covenantal world. And basically what I mean by that one is whether this passage belongs to the Old Covenant or the New Covenant. Makes a big difference in how you interpret. And then the theological or spiritual world in which the text was written. And that has to do with people's attitudes about God, people's attitudes about spirit beings and the afterlife, and so forth. So this is a whole external world in which the Bible is written that we need to understand. It helps us. It helps us if we have a grasp of that world to understand a biblical text. All right, so that's the two areas of observation, just to backtrack here and so we know where we are. We've been talking about observation, observing the text, seeing what it says, not trying to interpret yet, but just seeing what it says. The second step in exegesis is interpretation. The purpose of the interpretation phase is threefold: to identify principles, to hear the voice of God, and to formulate your proposition. So, to identify principles, let's talk about that first. Definition of a principle is a truth or foundational proposition that serves as the basis for a system of belief or behavior, or as the unifying thread for rational argument. So, a couple things about that definition. A principle is something that is not specific, it's general. It serves as the basis for a system of belief behavior. It's a truth, a foundational truth. It's a general truth that can be applied in multiple situations. Characteristics of principles. Principles are eternal. They will always be. They're not something that is just for a particular occasion. So when you're looking for principles, you're looking for something that applies at any time and any place. As I said, they are general rather than specific. They are predictive. If you have a good principle, a true principle that is, it is predictive of what will happen in certain situations. It is universal, and it is synthesizing, meaning that it takes the details that you've just researched in the observation phase and synthesizes it down into a concise statement. So that's what principle is. Let's look at some questions. I think you'll find these questions very helpful when trying to identify principles. So these questions, as you've already done your research on the observation phase, and you've already examined the text. And so now you're trying to narrow it down to what are the principles that I find here. Here are some questions that might help you. What is the cause behind this event, discourse, or narrative? What are some promises to God's people do we find in this passage? What does the passage say about the future? What is God's message to his people? What is the foundation that sustains this event, discourse, or narrative? What do we learn about God? What do we learn about people? What role does this passage play in the story of salvation? So in that last one, there is this meta-narrative that encompasses the whole Bible. What role does this particular passage play in that big grand scheme, that meta-narrative? I think these questions are really helpful. I will provide a link to these also on Populi. Okay, so then to hear the voice of God, all of Scripture was given to us to enable us to hear God's voice. It is him revealing himself. And then the third one is to formulate your proposition. You want to get to the place where you can write in one statement, one key statement, the proposition that you're going to expound in the final part of the exegesis. A proposition is a statement of the idea you want your reader to accept. Or it could be the statement of the course of action you want your reader to take. Another way to say this is that you've identified your principle, and now you're transforming that principle, that idea, into a full statement. Okay, and that takes us to the third part of the preparation phase, which is application. Application, it's the use of abstract concepts in particular and concrete situations. Here's some verbs that are related to the idea of application. To use something, to relate something, to specify, to choose, to develop, to contextualize, transfer. You're transferring the meaning of the text from its original context into the contemporary context. And to employ. Those are some verbs that can help you in your application of the text. So this diagram kind of explains the whole process. You can think of it as two inverted funnels. The top funnel is the observation phase, where you're gathering all kinds of details, all kinds of data are going into here about the text, about the context, etc. So then you get to the interpretive phase, and that's why you have this narrowing down, because you're synthesizing all this material and you're trying to narrow it down into a few principles that you find here. And then the latter phase, the application phase, you begin to expand it back out again. So now you're expanding it back out into the contemporary world. You're transferring the meaning of the data into today's life situations. And that basically will be the outline of your exegesis. That's an exegesis paper. All right, let's go over the second side of the diagram. Talk about the writing process. First step in writing anything is to just get it out on paper or on your notebook or your computer. I've heard people describe it as kind of not very pleasant idea, but vomiting the words out onto the paper. Just get it out there. Don't think a whole lot. Don't worry about grammar. Don't worry about if you've chosen the right words. Just get it out there. Okay? And then the second step is to organize it. And that's where, yes, you do want to begin looking at grammar, spelling. Use a spell checker. There's no excuse for misspelled words these days with all the spell checkers that we have. Organize it into your categories. And I've already given you the categories, the three headings of your paper: observation, interpretation, and application. Then you're going to go back and revise and edit. Always go back and revise and edit. So now let's look at the specifications for the paper. It's going to be written in Turabian. I have a link here to a place called OWL Purdue Online Writing Lab. Chicago, by the way, is the same as Turabian, just that Turabian's a shorter version of the Chicago manual. Kate Turabian decided to synthesize all that into a smaller version, but it's basically the same rules. So you can save a link to this website because it's very helpful. It has all the information about Turabian that you could possibly want or need. It has example pages, how to format them, how to cite references, specific examples of reference citing, etc., etc. Right here you get into the reference citing. So this is a very helpful tool. You will submit the paper as a Word document. I don't accept anything else other than Word, Microsoft Word. So don't submit it to me as a Apple Page document or as one of the open source documents. If you want to create it in that, that's fine, but make sure you convert it to Microsoft Word before you turn it in. 12 points Times New Roman or Courier New. I know those are old fonts and not really fancy. The whole purpose of a research paper is not to be fancy. It's to get the information. So we're not doing graphic design here. You want 1-inch margins, 5 to 8 pages long. You want to make sure that you include your headings. And let me show you something here. This is the heading style that I want. Your first level headings will be centered, bold. Never ever use underline. Underlining goes back to the days when we used typewriters. Since typewriters could not make bold print like your printing presses, writers would use underline, which indicated that it was to be italic or bold. Since we don't have that anymore, we don't need that anymore, we can use bold and we can use italic. There is absolutely no reason to have underline in any digital document. So heading level 1 is going to be bold, uppercase, and centered. Heading level 2 is going to be bold, lowercase, or capitalized, and to the left. And then the third level is going to be the same as the second level, except that the heading is included in the paragraph. As you can see here, it ends with a period, and then the first paragraph continues. That's your layout that I want for the paper. Also, notice what it says right here. All text, including headings, body, footnotes, bibliography, everything must be in the same font and the same font size. Don't use a larger font for some things, a smaller font for other things. Same font, 12 point for the entire paper. Okay, let's close that out. You need to submit it through Populi. And this is kind of what it looks like. There's going to be a place for you to drag and drop your document. I don't want you to submit your papers to me by email. I want you to use Populi. And then double-spaced all text, except there are some exceptions. The title page is not double-spaced. Footnotes are not double-spaced. Block quotations are not double-spaced. And the bibliography is not double-spaced. Let's move down to what to avoid. Plagiarism. Get familiar with what is meant by plagiarism. There is a great little diagram that I found online that explains what is considered plagiarism. You know, he goes through each one of these: identity theft, copycatting, cherry picking, mitosis, etc., etc., etc. He explains all of these are examples of plagiarism. Plagiarism is basically presenting either words, exact wording, or just the idea as if it were your own, and you know good and well that you got it from some book, some source. Anytime you do that, you're being deceptive. You're trying to give the professor the idea that this idea came from you, or the reader the idea that it came from you, when in reality it did not. So anytime you get an idea from someplace, you need to provide the source citation for that idea. So we're not just talking about word-for-word quotes, but ideas. There should be a lot of citations in an undergraduate paper. So you want to avoid plagiarism. You want to avoid grammatical errors. You want to avoid long quotations. Quotations should be short and few. There's nothing worse than seeing an entire page that's a quote. Generally, any kind of fact you need to cite a source for, because keep in mind that you are not an expert. You are a student. You are learning. And this may sound harsh, what I'm going to say, but your opinion doesn't count when it comes to writing an academic paper. If it's a reflection paper, yeah, that's when we are specifically asking for your opinion on something. But in a research paper, you are not the expert. Anything you say needs to be supported by evidence. So don't pull ideas and facts from the air. Support it. And that was the last point here. Avoid opinion without support. Okay, and so I think that does it. That's how you write an exegetical paper. Now, I will provide you, in fact, let me see if I can pull that up. A couple of resources. One is an example of an exegetical paper. So this is one that I wrote. It's a little more extensive than what I really expect of you. But as you can see, it's on the ascension narrative, Acts chapter 1, verses 6 through 11. And has the three sections of observation. And we move on down here. We have interpretation, where I try to identify the principles that were in that text, and then application. A word about application. Application is not just saying nice Christian cliches about, we need to pray more, we need to read the Bible more. Application, you're looking for something that's directly related to the text and how that should affect our behavior, how that should affect our attitudes, how that should affect our institutions. So I'm looking for specific applications when it comes to the application side. Remember, we started out specific, the specific details of the text. We went to general when we're talking about interpretation, and now we're getting specific again. So there's an example of an exegesis paper that you can look at. I will also make available to you a paper on Turabian. But again, if you go to that OWL site, you'll find all the information you need about Turabian. Okay, I hope that this is helpful, and I look forward to reading your papers. I'm excited. I think we're going to come up with some good stuff. God bless.